I want to welcome you to an exciting seminar that we have planned for you here at CPR, an online seminar, as we've gotten all used to, on misinformation and polarization in election campaigns. I am very happy that we have some researchers visiting from the University of Amsterdam, Ursula Daxecker, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, and Neeraj, Prasad, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science, but is known to many of us here in Delhi. Many of us have interacted with him over the years. I will introduce the rest of our panelists in a little bit of time. But I know that because we started a bit late and I want to be a bit mindful of the time, I'm going to sort of end the introduction here. And I'm just going to turn it over to Ursula and Neeraj to get started with their presentation. I'll just tell you guys, as they're putting their presentation up, we will then invite comments from the rest of our panelists, Siddharth Singh and Dr. S.Y. Quraishi. Then I will lead a structured question and answer for 15 minutes. And then we'll open it up to all of you for Q&A. As you listen, if you do have, just put questions in there, and we'll make sure that the questions get asked and answered. Okay. So over to you, Ursula and Neeraj.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neelanjan, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks for the invitation and this opportunity to share work with this wonderful panel of experts who are so knowledgeable on Indian politics. We haven't had as many opportunities to present our work in India as we would like for reasons that are obvious, but we're grateful for this opportunity today. So what we'll do today is actually present to you research on polarization in India from 3 ongoing work papers in progress. One of those papers is co-authored with Hanne Fjelde from the University of Uppsala. But empirically in India, one of the papers focuses on Uttar Pradesh and the other 2 focus on West Bengal. So we can move to the next slide. Neeraj, please. Okay, great. Yeah, so these are the 3 papers. In the first paper, which is based on data from the recent UP elections, here we are interested in the conditions under which voters support parties who engage in violence against outgroups. And then in the second 2 papers, those focus on West Bengal, and Neeraj will present those. There we are interested in the conditions under which misinformation can be effective as a strategy for political parties. And all of these papers deal with what we consider to be threats to democracy in India, but they're threats to democracy in a way from below. So they focus on citizen attitudes and to what extent citizen attitudes, to the extent that they are relevant for democracy, that is the dimension that we're exploring. So moving on now to the first paper, to tell you a little bit about the motivation. If we can move to the next slide again, Neeraj, sorry. Yeah, so this paper, and one more slide. So this paper, as I mentioned, is interested in support for violence and also support for politicians who are alleged to have engaged in violence. And the motivation for this paper really comes from an apparent contradiction where on the one hand, we know that people dislike political violence. We know this, for example, from public opinion surveys where people usually say that, supermajorities say that violence in politics is never acceptable. But we also know this from experimental studies, including from some studies on UP. There's a paper by Abhijit Banerjee et al. That finds that voters are less likely to vote for politicians convicted of murder. On the other hand, we also know that politicians linked to violent actors or allegedly having engaged in violence often do well in elections or even win elections, including in democracies such as India, so even in context where voters could punish parties for violence. So the main question we therefore ask is under what conditions voters fail to sanction politicians for violence, or whether voters may, under some conditions, even be willing to support or demand violence in response to an incident. And so we developed 3 expectations in the paper that kind of guide then the empirical findings that I will present. So the first expectation is that citizens are more likely to support violence if it is legitimized. And here we argue that politicians can legitimize violence by constructing narratives that justify violence against an outgroup as a legitimate response to, let's say, an injustice, a provocation, or a threat by this outgroup. And this narrative and this legitimization process doesn't necessarily require that the outgroup has done anything in particular. It could even be that incidents perpetrated by politicians, supporters who legitimize violence as a response to a threat. And in this first expectation, we build a lot on important work done by Paul Brass, particularly also on UP, who emphasized in his work that the production of violence and the narratives created around it are fundamentally a political process. Now, the second expectation that we develop is then bringing in partisanship. And here we're arguing that citizens are more likely to support violence by their own party. And this follows from when violence is properly legitimized. So if violence is successfully legitimized by politicians, we anticipate that voters who share the partisanship of parties linked to violence would be more likely to support the party, even if it engages in violence in this incident. And we expect that this could happen both for core and likely supporters of the party. Now, conversely, if violence is legitimized, but a party responds with peace to an incident, then core partisans could actually become less supportive of the party in question. And here we draw on a lot of work on the importance of partisanship for information processing, including on India, but also many other democratic contexts. And then the third expectation logically follows from the second one. Here, if supporters of a party increase their support, if it engages in violence, while non-supporters decrease their support, if a party engages in violence, polarization between parties naturally follows. Now, moving on to the empirical context in which we conduct our study, usually I would, at this point, have to go into a long discussion for why UP is relevant. This is thankfully not necessary with this audience today. But just to give you a little bit of context, we conducted our survey after the March elections. These elections were important for UP, but also at the national level. The elections were free and fair and also free of violence on election days. So we are definitely arguing that the ECI did a good job in managing this election. But what we also note is that both before and after elections in this one, but also others, low intensity violence still takes place. This low intensity violence usually revolves around the Hindu-Muslim cleavage, and more often Muslims are the victims. So we present our results today from the perspective of the BJP. This is partly a sample size issue because our sample for Muslim respondents is smaller, but I do want to highlight that we also exposed SP voters, which includes Muslims, but also Hindus. We also exposed them to a vignette in which we presented a violent incident. So we're definitely equal opportunity offenders in the sense that we think that all voters are in principle susceptible to this kind of narrative construction and legitimization process that we're interested in. So what this figure therefore shows, because we are presenting our results from the perspective of what would be an electoral strategy that would benefit the BJP, I'm showing you the electoral demography of UP from this perspective. And from the perspective of the BJP, Muslims are the least likely to support the party. Yadav OBCs and Jatav scheduled castes are also unlikely supporters because they're championed by the SP and the BSP, which leaves non-Yadav OBCs and non-Jatav SCs as important swing voters for the BJP and upper caste Hindus as core supporters. Now, both of those demographics together, likely supporters and core supporters together, are 55% of the electorate. So that opens up ample space to win over a plurality of voters. Okay, so moving on to the design of the survey, we had a large sample, which is important in a state the size of UP, and also a representative sample. And we fielded the survey after people voted, but before results were announced. This is a nice perk resulting from the very complex logistics of Indian elections. It's, maybe not from a democratic politics perspective desirable to have elections spread out like this, but it's logistically necessary. but it allowed us to not influence the electoral process when we fielded our survey, and at the same time ensure that respondents weren't affected by the outcome. So with that, moving on to the design of the vignette, which is kind of the core of our study. So we constructed 2 vignettes. As I said, we had a vignette for Hindu respondents where Muslims were the outgroups, but we also designed a vignette for Muslims with Hindus as the outgroup. We're presenting results for Hindus also because of time constraints. And this vignette relies on an incident of violence against Salman Khurshid. As I suspect many of you have heard, this is based on a real incident that happened in November last year, where Salman Khurshid, as an important Congress leader, who also happens to be Muslim, had his house vandalized. Now, we used a real incident here to avoid deceiving voters with fake violence, but also chose a relatively mild incident for ethical reasons. And now recall that our expectations focus on 2 dimensions, one being that violence is legitimized through a narrative, and this is what we call here context, without context versus with context. And the second dimension is that the party's role or the party's actions in response to this incident. So I'll first talk about the first dimension on the narrative presented to voters, so context or no context. Here we vary whether respondents are exposed to information that justifies vandalism against Salman Khurshid or not. So in the columns here, you see that the context is highlighted in bold. So in respondents who received the additional context, who received the narrative, they were told that the vandalism against Salman Khurshid happened because he had written a book comparing Hindu militants to ISIS and the Taliban, which is also true. This is in the book. And then the second dimension focuses on the party's role. And this is what you can see in the row. And here we vary whether the BJP responded to the incident with a request for peaceful dialogue. You can see that in the top row, or whether the BJP was involved in the violence. So this is in the bottom row. And this is also true. There was a local BJP leader there leading the mob on that day. Okay, so moving on to the final point on research design, and then I will show you the results. So I already said we had 2 vignettes for Hindu and Muslim respondents. Our key independent variables are the context presenting a narrative versus also the response by the party. And then the dependent variables that we expose respondents to immediately after they see the vignette is to ask them whether they approve of the violence in this incident. And then second, to ask them whether they approve of the party's role, the party's action, where the treatment, whether they approve of the party's response, sorry. Okay, so now on to our results. I'll be very brief on the results for our first dependent variable, which is support for the vandalism in the incident or the violence. Here we find that presenting a narrative, legitimizing violence increases support, and this support increases across all voters, so Hindus, Muslims, all subgroups, but is stronger for Hindu respondents. Now, the second dependent variable, this is the one that we're more theoretically interested in. Here, the dependent variable is whether a respondent approves or disapproves of the party's action. And first, I want you to look at the leftmost panel in this figure. And what we see here is that for all voters, support for the party, which could be BJP or SP, depending on whether respondents are Hindus or Muslim, for all respondents, support for the party increases if it uses violence and reduces if it responds with peace. So you can see that in the diamond, the gray diamond, and also then the peaceful response would be the round shape, the round bullet. But what the remaining 2 panels in the figure show is that these effects are very much influenced by whether voters are BJP supporters or not. So in the middle panel, we're showing you results for Hindu voters who are not BJP supporters. And we find that they become more supportive of the BJP if the BJP responds with peace. So they reward peace, and they become less supportive if the BJP engages in violence. And the opposite effect, so the rightmost panel is what we find for BJP voters. So Hindus who voted for the BJP become more supportive of the BJP if it uses violence in the incident while they sanction the party for peace. And in effect, BJP voters disapprove of peace, which we can see in the fact that the response for those exposed to the peace treatment is below 0. So they are moving into the disapproval zone. Now, the final set of results that I want to share with you before I hand over to Neeraj is our results for swing voters. As I have mentioned before, we are also interested in whether this legitimization of violence could benefit not only with increased support from core voters, but also from swing voters. And we're showing you these results again from the BJP's perspective. And in this figure, the middle panel is the most important one, because those are the most important swing vote groups for the BJP, the non-Yadav OBCs and the non-Jatav SCs. And our most important result here is the panel B, which shows that non-Yadav OBCs reward violence and punish peace by the BJP. They become more supportive if the BJP uses violence and less supportive if it uses peace. Now, this effect is weaker than for BJP voters, but still statistically significant, which shows that legitimizing violence and even participating in it can be a strategy to persuade not just core voters, but also swing voters. Okay, so with that, I'm actually gonna skip those 2 slides for now, Neeraj, because I think I've probably already gone over time. Basically, what I want to highlight to conclude is that what our results show that is that voters may reward parties for violence under some conditions, and that can increase polarization. But we also want to emphasize that violence needs to be legitimized for these effects to hold. So in all of the results that I just showed to you, the results held only for voters who also were presented with a narrative for the violence. And having talked about violence as an electoral strategy, we are now moving on to misinformation and whether that can also help parties win elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Neeraj?
Thank you. Thanks, Ursula, and thanks, Neelanjan. So when we are talking of misinformation, one is a lot of work on misinformation has happened in the context of US elections. And a lot of focus on misinformation has been first order. What are the conditions under which people believe it? What are the conditions under which they don't believe it? And whether misinformation is corrected? What happens when it is corrected? So we want to deviate from those studies on 2 parameters. One is shift the focus from US elections to Indian elections. And second is, instead of looking at first order effects, look at how does it influence voting behavior? How does it influence campaign dynamics? How does it influence social or partisan polarization? So that is where these 2 projects come in. So in the first case, we are not looking at WhatsApp or Twitter or Facebook, like these tend to be the main channels of misinformation. But we are looking at campaign misinformation, wherein what happens when political parties use misinformation in campaigning. And we question whether what is its effect? Does it lead to creating between party segmentation and within party cohesion, or does it lead to camps within your own party or within party factionalization? So in this first project, where we look at campaign misinformation, what we do is we study we develop a supply side perspective on misinformation. We study what happens when parties supply misinformation, and we argue that the impact of misinformation may depend on how individuals process misinformation. So if they process along partisan lines, so if person from party A spreads misinformation and people process that misinformation along partisan lines, then people who support party A will have a higher tendency to believe it as compared to people who do not support party A. So in the sense that misinformation may create a kind of a within party faction where half believe and half don't believe the misinformation and may even unite the opposition. But on the other hand, if that misinformation is processed along a social line, then it is quite possible that those who are not supporting that particular party may also believe in that misinformation, and it may lead to a party drawing more voters and gaining more support. So that is exactly our expectation, that when a party spreads misinformation, exposure to misinformation increases preference polarization among co-partisans at a higher rate. And correction information is more effective in reducing polarization among co-partisans. I'll explain what we mean by that. In terms of the research design, this is a random probability sample of 2,750 voters in West Bengal. It was fielded immediately after the election and before Durga Puja, so in that 6 months window. And because a lot of that misinformation has to do with religion and politics, so this was like a sweet spot between the two. And also, we did not want to field the survey during elections because, as you would know, the Delta wave was pretty dominant during the election cycle, and we didn't think it would have been appropriate to field an in-person survey during that time. So this is the first experiment that we did. What had happened is sometimes in India and West Bengal, Muharram and Durga Puja they overlap. And this had happened in 2017. And BJP had kind of made it an issue that specifically Yogi Adityanath had campaigned and said that Mamata Banerjee allows only Muharram and she does not allow Durga Puja. And the opposition, like one of the leaders from Indian Secular Front, which is not secular in the sense that that's the more Muslim leaning party. It's secular in name only, but it was in alliance with the left, and they had made it an issue that to point out that Mamata Banerjee allows only Durga Puja. But actually, what had happened was that the court had kind of directed the government to chart out the routes for the Muharram procession and the Durga Puja procession, and the government had implemented it. And in general, Mamata Banerjee had been very populist in the sense she had given money for Muharrams, or she had given money to Islam, to clerics, Muslim clerics, and then she had given money for Durga Puja pandals. So she was kind of being equal opportunity in that sense. So what we did is we had 5 groups. To the control group, we just said that sometimes Muharram and Durga Puja processions overlap. Then we had a group which was exposed to Yogi Adityanath's campaign, specifically a newspaper clip, which said that in that clip, Yogi Adityanath says, why Muharram and not Durga Puja? And that in that clip, Yogi Adityanath says that Mamata allows Muharram processions but not Durga Puja. This government creates obstacles for Saraswati Puja and Janmashtami. And the other group was told that Mamata allows Ram Navami but not Muharram, and this government also creates problems for other Muslim festivals. And then there were 2 other groups who were kind of given a correction treatment, in which they were told that an independent investigation reveals that this allegation is false, and the government allowed both Durga Puja and Muharram. So this is our experiment. 5 groups. One is the control, 2 are misinformation. In the misinformation, one is told about an allegation of Muslim favoritism. The other is told about an allegation of Hindu favoritism. And then we have 2 correction groups. After that, we asked them 2 questions. We asked them that if there is an overlap in the future between Muharram and Durga Puja, what should the government do? And the options were that help only Hindus, help only Muslims, help both Hindus and Muslims, and do nothing. Now, do nothing kind of corresponds to a very laïcité secularism that is seen in France, help both Hindus and Muslims is closer home in terms of how we interpret secularism to be. So we treat both of these options as secularism. Help only the majority, that is Hindus, we treat it as a preference for majoritarianism. And help only Muslims, the minority group, we treat it as a support or a preference for minoritarianism. So you have three, you have secularism, majoritarianism, and minoritarianism. And we assign a value of 0 to secularism, +1 to majoritarianism, and -1 to minoritarianism. And then we calculate our dependent variable becomes polarization. So the respondent's squared distance to the median preference. And what we find is that this is without correction. So we are kind of comparing those who got the misinformation to those who did not get the misinformation. So 0 kind of represents the control group, and 1 kind of represents the treated group, the group treated with misinformation. And what we observe is that among non-BJP supporters, any kind of misinformation more than doubles polarization among the BJP supporters. And among non-BJP supporters, misinformation has no effect. It does not polarize the group. And we find that that kind of effect even persists after correction is administered, where the BJP supporters continue to be polarized as compared to non-BJP. So our basic claim is this, that what the party that is spreading misinformation would have wanted is to divide the electorate into 2 groups, into 2 camps. One who think that Mamata Banerjee is not secular or appeases the Muslims, and one who think that Mamata Banerjee is secular. And presumably those who think that Mamata Banerjee is not secular would go and vote for BJP. But instead what happens is the majority continue to believe that the TMC government is secular. And instead of getting within party, instead of creating 2 segments in the electorate, one of whom have a preference which aligns with BJP and the other preference with alliance with TMC, what we find is BJP support base is split into 2 camps. One who think that Mamata Banerjee is secular, and one who think that no, Mamata Banerjee appeases Muslims. So when your own camp is split into 2, where one would prefer a secular response and one would prefer a majoritarian response, it stymies your ability to kind of develop a platform which appeals to all of your voters. So that is why we call it kind of poisoning your own well, because people who don't support you are not going to believe you, and only half of those who support you are going to believe you. So when Donald Trump says that the elections were stolen, no Democrat is going to believe him. So essentially what happens is there are 2 camps among Republicans, one who believe that the elections was free and fair, and the other who believe that Biden stole the elections. So we see something similar happening over here. Then the second study is somewhat more straightforward, again, in which we are trying to look at how does these hostile misinformation kind of shape social attitudes. So we are trying to look at social polarization. And essentially, this, like, starting with BJP, a lot of these political parties maintain WhatsApp groups. And recently there has been a study by Simon Chauhard and his colleagues in which they find that about 2% or 4% of the messages are to do with outgroups. And like a good 86% of the messages are phatic messages like good morning, happy Diwali, and things like that. So what is the effect of these 2 or 4% messages where they show the outgroup in some kind of a negative light? So we try to measure what is the effect of a hostile image that is being shared on WhatsApp on kind of outgroup attitudes and on polarization. And our main argument is that once you have been exposed to a hostile image, it might lead to an affective polarization, because it might lead some to reduce the way in which they view outgroups. It's a similar study. In this, what we do is we show them we show people who are treated with misinformation an idol of goddess Kali, which was found damaged at a temple, and then there was this and this is a true story where this idol was found damaged, and then there was this misinformation that it was actually an act of vandalism. And to some, we provide a kind of a correction that no, it broke due to neglect. So what we do is we take a control group. To the control group, we just ask, what are your feelings towards Hindus? What are your feelings towards Muslims? How would you feel if you had a Hindu neighbor? How would you feel if you had a Muslim neighbor? And we ask the respondent to rate all of these questions from 0 to 100. So this is the control group. For the treatment group, what we do is we divide them into 3 groups. One, we just give pure misinformation. That is just the WhatsApp forward and nothing else, without the correction. And then we ask these 4 questions. The other is kind of given a generic correction where they are told that it's not true, the idol broke due to neglect, and then we ask these 4 corrections. And finally, we give a priest correction in which we say that a priest, kind of the temple priest, confirmed that the idol broke due to neglect. And what do we find? We find that once you have been exposed to this kind of a message, then your feelings towards the outgroup, so feelings how Hindus rate Muslims and how Muslims rate Hindus, that decreases. And we do not find any corrective effect. And we also find that your feelings towards having a Hindus feeling towards having a Muslim neighbor decreases, and Muslims having a Hindu neighbor also decreases. So we find that this kind of a very benign message, which can also lead to a high degree of social polarization. But we don't see so much of partisan polarization. For partisan polarization, we would want BJP supporters and TMC supporters to react differently. While the effect size is stronger on BJP supporters than on TMC supporters, the directionality is the same for both BJP and TMC. So we cannot say that there is partisan polarization. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula and Neeraj, for that fascinating and actually comprehensive presentation. I know that the audience may not realize, but underneath this are 3 separate papers. So to be able to summarize them in such a efficient and as a comprehensive manner is quite a task. Just before I open it up to Siddharth for some comments, sort of as you would have heard, I think everyone can understand how important this research agenda is. Both trying to understand the role that partisanship plays in violence, but also an increasing challenge in not just the Indian system, but around the world, that misinformation plays in voter attitudes, political polarization, right? As I said, the presentation was very clear, and I think that a number of these findings are actually quite convincing. We do have a lot of hypotheses about why some of the changes we're seeing in various political systems are taking place today. It's nice to see some very rigorous empirical work testing these propositions and trying to understand exactly what's driving the kinds of outcomes that we see today. Siddharth Singh is editor at large at Open Magazine, and many of you will know from just a number of intellectual discussions across India, across Delhi, really insightful scholar. And so we're very pleased to have him to be able to make comments on these three papers and on this presentation. So Siddharth, over to you.
Thank you, Neelanjan, and thank you for your kind words. So I'll come to the third paper first, the one which deals with social polarization. And probably I find that the most convincing because I've probably in my experience, I've seen those kinds of things happening firsthand, that one misleading image can actually lead to a riot. And no amount of correction after the fact can undo the damage which has already been done. What I can say is that, let's say, as compared to even 15 or 20 years ago, when the mode of communicating that kind of misinformation was by word of mouth instead of WhatsApp or whatever, things are being corrected slowly. I mean, it's taking time. It's not that as if everything is fine, but the brazen use of that kind of messaging for electoral ends probably is limited now, but it's an ever-present danger. You can't be lax about it. So I'm in complete agreement over there. And the treatment effects with respect to BJP and non-BJP voters in Bengal, it's pretty convincing. At least the directionality is very clear. I can see that. So to that extent, I think empirically it makes much sense. And I won't comment on methods because I'm not trained to deal with those questions. Now, coming to the first paper, great. My question is that your treatment is about political violence, but your conclusions are about electoral outcomes. I'm not very sure whether, take, for example, your Salman Khurshid incident. Now that, as you know, happened in November 2021, and the elections were held in February 2022. So that's a gap of about 3 months. Now, it would require extraordinary memory effects for that message to remain and turn into an electoral outcome. I mean, I'm not denying that those effects are not possible, but given how voters behave in India, and there are studies which show that they make up their mind probably only in the last week, or as the elections they come closer, it's only the partisan in group, which is basically those core voters, that they have already made up their mind a long time ago. Probably they would be the ones who would be more influenced by that kind of messages. So it just I mean, I really don't know, because if the scope of that message, or if the intent of that message is to get your group to support you, that is already there. They are more persuaded by those kinds of messages. In all likelihood, they have already made up their minds. And if you're talking about for this kind of a messaging to continue right until the election, probably that messaging would have to be continuous in case the memory effect is not so strong. So that is one issue. On this particular study, you've chosen Uttar Pradesh, to do that. If I may, because the issue is about violence and electoral outcomes, probably Bengal would have been a better study, because that's where you observe violence was reported during elections over there. In contrast, in Uttar Pradesh, this time in 2022, I'm not sure if there was any large-scale violence, because the press was there to observe it in full strength. The Election Commission of India, it's always sensitized to these kinds of things. So that's one issue. The second thing is that the treatment effect is strongest for the core group. It's very evident from your data. But this is an election where you cannot win only by getting the core group on your side, and you need to have other, if not total outgroups, at least the swing part as much as you can get on that side. And there the treatment effect seems to weaken significantly. I mean, you say that it is statistically significant, I believe you, but the question is that if the intensity of that effect is going down, how would it translate into, electoral outcome? I'm not very sure about. I mean, it wasn't very clear to me. That's if the wider group is not responsive to that kind of messaging, I'm not sure if any party would want to do that, use that kind of a political violence as a strategy to get hold of more voters on their side. So that's this thing. And the third thing, I don't have much to say. I was just engrossed in hearing you guys, and you talk about low intensity violence before and after elections, right? In Uttar Pradesh, in the first paper. Now, I can understand that violence before elections as a device to polarize or whatever, but why would any party want to do violence after elections, even if it is low intensity elections? Because the electoral phase is over, everything is done and dusted. Probably it's going to be counterproductive. You're going to, the messaging is going to turn negative. People are going to say that they are generally violent. Once the deed is done, once elections are over, it's practically over. Probably that's what I would say. But very interesting studies in the end.
Thank you, Siddharth, for those careful comments. Just a quick note to the audience. We have a Q&A box here, question and answer. So any questions that people might have, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. I promise that we will get to them in short order. One other just quick comment. Unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we're not able to bring Dr. Quraishi into this panel, but he does send his regrets, and we hope that Dr. Quraishi can provide some comments to the authors offline. Before I get to some questions that I might have, let me just turn it over to Ursula and Neeraj. Did you want to respond at all to Siddharth's comments, or?
Yeah, definitely.
We can, and then we can break into some question and answers for the audience.
Yeah, no, I'd like to briefly respond, and maybe Neeraj also. No, thank you so much for the comments, right? And if something doesn't make sense, then we want to know about it. And also we care most about, do the arguments line up for people who understand the context very well, and so I think these are extremely helpful comments. Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that you like the last paper and that you find those findings compelling. And I guess that the one thing I'd add, right, is it's also in a way West Bengal should be a difficult case for finding these effects, because generally speaking, the partisan cleavage is so much stronger. So the fact that we find actually that a treatment that primes religion has an effect, and has an effect on the BJP supporters, but also Hindus more broadly, is actually probably a difficult case to show that. A couple of responses, to your comments on the first paper. So, I mean, you're exactly right that it's not reasonable to expect voters to remember this incident about Salman Khurshid. And in fact, I would say that the way we supplied the treatment doesn't require that, right? Because we basically, whether people knew about this incident or not, we reminded them about it, or we told them about it for the first time. So every respondent in our study was actually read this prime about the incident. And so unfortunately, we can't say anything as to whether people might have already known about the incident, whether they knew Salman Khurshid or not. But I think our main effect isn't really dependent on that either. So we use it as a stand-in. It's actually not really dependent on whether someone remembers the incident. Yeah. So, and then, you know, your points on why are we doing this for UP is a very good one. And we also have some work in progress on West Bengal. So it's definitely also a case that's very interesting for us. So we definitely agree with you that there was no large scale violence. And in fact, I think we would even argue that if a party wanted to use this as an electoral strategy, then relying on very low intensity violence, you know, violence that isn't particularly costly, that also doesn't bring with it investigations, would be the best way to do it. If I'm not saying it, you know, it's easy to pull off, but I think in a way we would almost expect that should be the kind of violence that we would want to use. And I also would say that our argument isn't necessarily dependent on a party themselves engaging in it, but they could also use incidents that are actually completely unrelated and engage in this narrative production. And I think in many ways, this is what Paul Brass's work has told us, right? That whenever violence happens, you get these, you know, competing stories, you get multiple stories, and which one becomes the dominant narrative is up to like power configurations, is up to what becomes represented in various media, which also, you know, can differ across media channels, right? I think on the Indian case, there's a lot of, I've heard a lot about how, you know, English media and Hindu language media are quite different on that. So if a party would be really good at this, right, then they could use unrelated incidents and still use them to create this narrative and use it as a strategy to win over voters. And on your point on the swing voters, yes, you're a very good observer. You've noticed that our effect is weaker for swing voters. And I think, in fact, we would expect that, right? That the core voters would be the most responsive. So I guess I'd say I would still find it somewhat worrisome that it also works for swing voters. But yeah, so I don't know. And then last on, like, why do we see violence after elections? So in this paper, the incident that we expose voters to, well, they've already voted, right? So we don't want to be in the business of affecting anybody's vote choice. Like, that's not really what we're interested in, but we're interested in exploring from a research perspective, you know, what are kind of systematic effects of providing people with this information. So it already happened after the election, but the violent incident, I don't think we said anything about the timing, right? Like, when did it happen vis-a-vis the election? But it was before the outcome was announced. So I guess from that perspective, I think it's still fair to say that it would have been more of a pre-election violence treatment. Now, violence after elections does happen, and it's kind of an interesting, right? I think it's maybe kind of a puzzling finding, but I mean, in West Bengal, it happened after the most recent elections and also after the 2019 elections. And why, right? Like, why does that make sense? Well, it could be a kind of punishment.
Yeah.
Like, if a party is very strong and very coercive, and some say this about the TMC, then it could actually use it as a punishment. It might be an intra-party dynamic. It could be that. So I have talked to some people in West Bengal, and so, you know, obviously I'd also be interested to hear what Neelanjan thinks about this. But they said that in a way, you know, this might almost be a reward sometimes for like low-level party cadres, where after the violence, they're allowed to engage in some violence. I don't know, right? I can't, this is not something I can prove, but this is one explanation that I've heard, just to respond to that question. But thank you so much for the excellent comments. Neeraj, did you want to add something?
Sure. So there are two things, and thanks for your comments, Siddharth. So there are two things. One is the first was on electoral violence. You know, the election commission or you know, electoral observers, and that entire machinery is geared towards observing whether there's any kind of a violence that is happening 1 month before the elections, during the day of the elections, and things like that. And that is what is generally construed as electoral violence. However, our goal was a little different. Our goal was whether you can use violence not to intimidate, not to suppress turnout or anything, but whether you can use it to mobilize citizens or not. And that is happening almost 3, 4, 5 months before the elections, where there are certain issues which are instrumentalized, and there is violence around that, and that is used to bring out voters, to mobilize supporters. And in that context, Uttar Pradesh is a good place. It's yeah, unlike Kerala and West Bengal, it's not that it's not like the suppression kind of a violence is happening. It's not that people cannot go and register to vote, or it's not that the opposition cannot, even file for candidacy. That kind of a violence does not happen in Uttar Pradesh. But the kind of violence that we were interested in exploring, whether you can use violence to mobilize support or not, that definitely does happen in Uttar Pradesh. The second is, yes, like we debated a lot in terms of, because a lot of studies measure outcome as whether or not you will vote for BJP or whether or not you'll vote for the party. But voting is such a like there's so much of noise that is captured in your voting decision that we wanted to strip out all that noise. So instead of that, what we say is that we just describe this incident to you, and BJP responded with peace or BJP responded with violence. And given this response, how do you rate BJP's response? So we wanted to see what is the single marginal effect of this BJP's response and how do people rate it, whether it motivates people or whether it, so there would be a lot of people who may get demotivated by BJP's response and may still go and vote for them. So that also exists. So yeah, so that is the reason, like we are not capturing voting for BJP as much as support for BJP's participation in peace or violence.
Neelanjan?
Yes, Siddharth, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with them, but I think the voting decision for any individual is a fairly complicated mix. We always try to look in terms of a single variable explanation. That generally does not work, and I mean, look at the BJP. It's probably one of the most successful political machines in recent history. But when I look at, I mean, I'm not going into methods again. I mean, the kind of effort which they put into welfare schemes, things like that, the signal that I get is that they think that they're on a losing trend if they're not going to do that. I mean, the kind of effort which goes into those kinds of, I mean, be it gas cylinders, be it water pipe connections, be it toilets, be it homes. I mean, if indeed, I mean, not to question your findings in any way. I mean, I agree about the point about violence in general. But if violence was such an effective strategy, there probably would be no need to get into those kinds of messy logistical issues about services delivery, goods delivery. Those kinds of public goods. They've actually turned private goods into public goods. I mean, that's a very complicated exercise in itself. Just that my point is limited to that. I'm just trying to understand that how are these effects disentangled? And yeah, Neelanjan, go ahead.
I think we would agree with you on this fully, right? We're not disagreeing that might be as important, more important, probably. So yes.
So Ursula and Neeraj, what I wanted to do in sort of a short Q&A session is, I think, what is appropriate, I think, for a set of papers like this, ask a couple of maybe more technical or theoretically informed questions from a poli-sci perspective, just to sort of get a sense of, and I think that's kind of feedback that authors are always looking for, sort of do a bit of that and then sort of open up the audience. So the first is, and I say this as somebody who has written a bit in this field, right? And so also on misinformation, right? I've written with some of the Americanists who are working on this stuff. And there are questions that, I think we even had as we're conducting the research, in terms of what we're doing. So I want to sort of get a sense, because you are embarking on this big agenda, right? So, one of the challenges that we face when we're thinking about research, so first to start with sort of misinformation or disinformation, is that what tends to be so crucial to the story, at least the way that it's told in narrative form, is about who is sending the piece of information and the medium through which it's being sent, right? So it could be my relative on a WhatsApp group, right? right? Or it could be my friend on Facebook, right? And so what does it mean to be testing misinformation in this kind of, and this is actually the work that I've also done, right? In this kind of survey vignette format, right? How do you relate these empirical findings, which have theoretical import, to what might be in an empirical or practical sense, the way that misinformation or disinformation is being spread in many contexts, and the disjuncture between the two of these things? I mean, so how would you, if let's imagine there's a policymaker, Quraishi Sab unfortunately wasn't able to join us, but he would say, okay, look, I agree with you. Okay, but the problem I'm facing in the election commission is that people, uncles and brothers and sisters, are spreading this information through WhatsApp. What do the magnitude of these findings in empirical terms, or the direction of these findings, tell us about the standard mechanism that is used to disseminate misinformation? So, it's a question to you.
Yeah, I can maybe start, and then I'm sure Neeraj has something to add. Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? It's, of course, it's an artificial setting. It's not like getting an actual WhatsApp message from a WhatsApp uncle. But I mean, we are trying to approximate it. The message looks like a WhatsApp message, and we did field the survey on like large phones. So I mean, like it reasonably approximates, I guess, the real context. But yeah, of course, I think there are some validity questions of not doing it in the way it happens in the real world. I mean, I would say probably, if anything, that would probably weaken the chance of finding an effect. And the fact that we still do, yeah, helps maybe address that somewhat. At the same time, I'd say, right, from an ethical perspective, actually sending people these kinds of WhatsApp messages, which, as Siddharth has pointed out, right, like they can lead to violence. There are a lot of ethical problems with that. And I know that Simon, his project, like he's working on a bunch of things on also, addressing those kinds of aspects. But in our study, for those two reasons, we decided to go this route, right? Like make the message mimic an actual one, but still control, as researchers, how it's administered, how someone might respond, be able to do something if we think it triggers some kind of reaction. Yeah. And then I think you asked something about magnitude. I don't know, do you want to respond to that or something?
No, I mean, sorry, go ahead. Neeraj? Yeah, so I mean, how do you think the magnitude of these effects would change, basically, if you had changed medium and source?
Right, yeah, probably it weakens the effect. Yeah. Neeraj, did you want
to? Yeah, like, so there is this thing about the medium and how the misinformation spreads. And there's a lot of research which is trying to see what happens when misinformation is going on WhatsApp, when it is going through friends, when it is going. So a lot of research on platforms. And then there's a lot of research on the demand side, like what happened, why do people believe it? But there's very little in terms of the supply side. Why do parties supply it? What is the implication in terms of voting behavior? What is the implication in terms of polarization? And while that is also an important question in terms of how important is the medium. Medium is very important. We wanted to take one step back and just look at what happens when there is campaign misinformation in terms of voting behavior, in terms of preferences, in terms of preference polarization, in terms of partisan polarization. And that has kind of motivated the design of the second experiment, at least.
So I think that's, I mean, a convincing response. I mean, this is sort of the way that I respond to that question as well, right? I mean, in that, I think that you have to approximate something that, if you were to actually approximate the real mechanism, or be very close to the real mechanism, there will be all kinds of ethical boundaries that are being crossed, right? So this is sort of what we have at our disposal. The other sort of question I have, and I again said I've done some of this kind of work, right? So you are talking about a single event, right? And one of the characteristics we think of with misinformation, fake news, so on and so forth, is the sheer volume of it, right? So if you think about our prototypical WhatsApp misinformation, it's Simone's study that you were saying, that sort of you look at these groups, 86% of it is junk, but still 10%, I mean, you're getting multiple messages a day in a group. And so how do you sort of resolve the fact that the real mechanism that we sort of have in mind is one which is basically death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's that you are getting huge amounts of misinformation that are saying all kinds of crazy things that may slowly shift people's preferences one way or another, or may not, right? May polarize people one way or another. Why would we expect one piece of information to have a huge polarizing effect when this is the pattern of misinformation that we actually see on the ground?
So yeah, there are two things. One is the access of the misinformation, and the second is the number of misinformation points. Now, the access of misinformation remains pretty consistent in the sense, like in the West Bengal case, BJP's campaign, the access of misinformation was that we have to paint the incumbent as a pro-Muslim, anti-Hindu. So they might have sent a plethora of misinformation messages. One saying that, oh, Mamata Banerjee is actually a Muslim and here is a photo in a burqa. Oh, Mamata Banerjee gave money to this imam. Oh, Mamata Banerjee prevented this pandit from doing that. Or this temple is... So the access remains pretty consistent, which our study replicates. But yeah, we do not expose them to multiple misinformation messages along the same axis. That I concede, but the axis remains, especially a very disciplined campaign like BJP's. There, I don't see too much of variation in terms of the kind of issues on which they are trying to feed misinformation.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I would also say again, right, to expose people to a barrage of these misinformation events would again raise some ethical issues. I think we could even say doing it with one event, right? Like, I mean, we have a long ethics discussion in both of our papers where we talk about, because even if you supply some respondents with a correction, others do not get the correction, and for that reason it's also really important to do a good debriefing, and that's why I think also in-person surveys are indispensable in this context, because online I don't know that any survey respondents will ever pay any attention to the debriefing. Yeah, so it's not a great answer, but I do think it's still a relevant one, because yeah, there would be real concerns, right, with trying to polarize people. And again, if anything, right, a single event would attenuate the kind of effect that we can find.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree, right? I mean, I think this is just, I think a lot of times as political scientists, especially in the setting that we're in with CPR, we're dealing with people who are practitioners, who are, trying to think about these as policy problems, and trying to think about what we are doing, because many of us are using very similar tools here to try to understand fake news, misinformation, its impact, how it might relate to the work that they do. Sorry, Ursula, what was it?
Yeah, no, sorry, but just to add as one more point, right? I think the nice message of the second paper is, or like from a policy or normative perspective, is that we find that actually misinformation didn't work particularly well. And it didn't work well because it basically, primed these partisan cleavages, and because also the TMC ran a really good campaign that focused on Bengali identity and like a much broader identity rather than responding with, then like doing things that could be portrayed as appeasing Muslims. So yeah, like, and they had good input, right? Also for this campaign from what's the guy's name?
Prasad Kishore.
Right, yeah. So it also tells us something about how parties can actually respond and what a good response would look like. So there's a bit of a silver lining from that paper.
It's the final thing, and this is just how you sort of think about your design and always struggle in these kinds of studies. How strong, what message, obviously, I'm sure you put in inordinate amount of time thinking about what message you put into any sort of survey experiment setting. So the abstract idea, I'm always struck by this one idea that you see when you first learn game theory and theories of persuasion, which is that if two people are speaking to each other, nobody should ever be able to persuade you. And the reason is that if I have a different preference than somebody else, I know that the only information they're going to give me is to move me towards their position. They'll never give me the other information, which might move me away from their position, right? So in other words, everyone always has an incentive to give me biased information if they're trying to convince me towards the position, right? So, one of the mysteries we have is we know that, and I bet you a lot of your respondents know that a lot of the information perhaps coming from the other side, if they're TMC supporters with the BJP or BJP supporters with TMC, is misinformation, cannot be trusted. So how do you have some abstract sense of, what is the procedure here, right? So one mental model would be that people have very, very weak priors about many things in this world. The party that I support, let's say for partisan polarization, is saying something about the world that largely is consistent with my worldview, so I will believe in. It's my opinion, reader. It's my message. It's a follow the leader phenomenon. This is similar to Pranav's question. Right? Or do you believe that there's actually some actual shifting of preferences happening, right? Is this a situation where your vignette, by attaching a party or a set of characters, is essentially informing the respondent how they should think about an issue? Or is it a situation where actual preferences are being shifted? Do you have, some abstract sense of what you believe is happening with your respondents in a situation like this?
Yeah, so I can get us started on this. I think it's a great question. And I did want to also respond to that one because, yeah, as you say, it came up in the Q&A. So I think the paper that can speak the best to this is the first one, right? Because we tried to get precisely around this issue that someone who's a BJP partisan, how do we separate that from the violent incident? And that's why we split the vignette into two parts and why we have the two dimensions, because the second dimension varies. It's always the BJP, right? So the BJP responds with peace or the BJP was involved in the violence. So any effect that we find, right, if it's just party, then we should find that a voter should always, who's a co-partisan, should always become more supportive, right? Then they should support peace, they should support violence, regardless of the treatment, if it's just about party cheerleading. But we actually find the opposite, right? We find that BJP voters punish the party if it doesn't engage in the expected response or the desired response or the response that our treatment is supposed to induce, which is that they should actually ask for violence if you're legitimizing it. And they punish the party for peace. So I actually think the design gets around this issue that we're just finding partisan cheerleading. And that's why I also thought, yeah, I think it's a great question, but I don't think it's correct that we're just showing, a partisanship effect. Whether we're persuading, whether this persuades, right? Like about the persuasive implications, I think that's much harder, right? Like, what does it mean if someone goes out to vote because, you're doing canvassing, or like, are you really persuading people, or is it a mobilization? effect, I don't know. I think it's going to be very hard to answer, but I think our effects are consistent with the treatment actually working, because that would be the desired response if a party actually engages in this strategy.
Neeraj, did you want to say something?
So I have. So this is something that.
Thank you, Ursula. I forgot to say thank you, Ursula. Neeraj, go ahead. So
in terms of how people are evaluating this misinformation, like I have some thoughts on this, and I'm not saying that these are empirically validated thoughts. These are just my thoughts.
That's how I asked this question as well.
Thinking exercise. Yeah. This is the way I've been thinking of it. So Donald Trump may say that Obama is a Kenyan, a Muslim, and he also says that Hillary Clinton is incompetent, right? Now this claim can be processed along partisan lines or along gendered lines. So if it is processed along partisan lines, then what will happen is Republicans will believe, some like 50% of the Republicans will believe Trump, 50 will not, but no Democrat will believe, which could have been the case with Obama being a Kenyan. No Democrat believed that he's a Kenyan, and no Democrat believed that he's a closeted Muslim. And kind of it split the Republican base into two. I'm not saying it actually did, like just so it gets processed along partisan lines. With Hillary Clinton, when he says that Hillary Clinton is incompetent, there could be a gendered dimension. So it could either be that Democrats don't believe it and Republicans get split, or it could be that the misogynist male Democrat believes what Donald Trump is saying. So in a sense, he's able to extract some votes from the misogynist male Democrats into his own fold, right? Because it is getting processed along gender, not along party affiliations. So that is what I was thinking, whether this claim that Mamata Banerjee is a closeted Muslim or is pro-Muslim or anti-Hindu gets processed along your party identity, that you're BJP or not, or does it get processed along your religious identity, whether you're Hindu or not? Had it been processed along your Hindu identity, perhaps they would have been able to get some votes from not hardline, but maybe Hindu TMC voters. But that did not happen in this particular case. So yeah, so when I try to connect how this misinformation is processed, and whether that is leading to persuasion or not, I think a lot is happening in what axis is the misinformation falling. And it does not have to always be partisan or social, and it's not possible to ex ante know where it will fall. For example, 3 years ago, nobody would have imagined that COVID would become a partisan issue. If at all there were any vaccine deniers, they were the liberal California voters, right? The super liberal. It was not anybody in the red belt which was denying vaccines. But eventually vaccines and COVID became like it fell on partisan lines. So I think that is where the tension with misinformation is. You don't know where it is going to land. And if it lands on a partisan cleavage, then it damages you rather than boosting your vote share.
I mean, I agree. I've always thought, there must be studies that have done this in other contexts, but one way of sort of discerning is to have another random sort of variation where you ask people factual questions after they've been exposed to misinformation. Except for some people, there are consequences, there's a financial incentive to getting the answer right versus not. That would at least allow you to distinguish between the bias of people who are simply going with it because they believe their party told them to answer this way, as opposed to what they might actually believe is factually correct. Yeah, anyway, I mean, it remains a mystery, I think, sometimes, and even our
in fact, this what exactly you said, this works very well on misinformation studies looking at estate tax in the US, where there is a lot of tractability on people when people are told that they don't have to pay estate tax because they're not worth $2 million. Then that kind of correction works really well, because now there are some real numbers attached to factual perceptions and factual corrections.
So, I mean, anyway, so it's one of those interesting things, and I'm not sure, again, you know, there are questions of how one implements that. I wanted to get to some of the audience questions. I think some of them we've already asked and answered in our discussion, but so somebody asked us how you define the term violent party, and if I might just throw something on that. I mean, I think the study that you described talks about vandalism, but of course there are many kinds of violence, right? There's rioting, there's so on and so forth. The way I read your stuff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're not making a claim that one party is violent as opposed to another. Probably all parties engage in some kind of violence. How do you, though, conceive of, and this wasn't the goal of your study, imagine that you had changed what the violent activity was, right? From vandalism to something else, right? In the grand scheme of the kind of violence we see during politics, we were talking about West Bengal, vandalism is actually quite low, right? And you mentioned that you didn't want to stoke passion, which is why you didn't want to go beyond a certain point. Can you speculate, though, how your results may have changed if you consider different kinds of violence?
Yeah, I can speculate, and the question about what is a violent party, it's a good one. I actually, if we said that, it's actually not the claim we necessarily want to make. I mean, we've switched the title of the paper to party violence, and I think maybe we should even do party-based violence. So it's any kind of violence, right, where there's some alleged or actual link to also a politician or a party, right? And it might be that the only people involved were very local party cadres, and as you say, right, we're not suggesting only one party uses violence. I think you know, when we look at the campaign context, then BJP accused the SP of being communal and the other way around, right? So there were these competing allegations from both sides. Again, going back to this point that I emphasized, right, that with violence it always becomes this like foggy zone where there's competing interpretations and allegations, especially in a campaign context. So the term violent party is actually one we want to stay away from. So if it was on one of the slides or I said it, then it was a slip. But yeah, so it's really party-based violence, meaning that there's a violent incident where there's some allegations or yeah, so allegations is usually oftentimes also the kind of territory where these claims remain, but at the end of the day, one can look at the victims and the identity of the victims, and one can look at whether people were actually there. So in the very mild incident that we mentioned, a local BJP leader was there and was leading the mob, and he claims that he wasn't there when when the violence started, and what we think about that, that's up for everyone to decide. I think he was supposed to be arrested, but ultimately wasn't. But on your question about like, yeah, to what extent does this generalize to other kinds of violence? We have a bit of a discussion on that in the paper, and I'm sure Neeraj maybe wants to elaborate on that. But I would say I don't anticipate that it would be different for maybe more serious incidents. Yeah, I do think it might be a strategy to not let violence escalate beyond a certain point, and how you do that. I think that's a very good question, and one that I've thought about quite a bit, because I think it's also a very important question, you know, for the Indian context right now. Like with this recent controversy over the comments about the prophet, and you know, violence from both sides, right? And we should call it out also for both sides. Yeah, that seems to be escalating quite a bit. And how do you know, as a party, right, you actually would want to avoid that if you want to use it as an electoral strategy, and then how do you do that? But yeah, I'm handing over to Neeraj, who I'm sure wants to jump in on this.
Sure. So yeah, we were limited by the fact that we do not want to talk about extremely violent events. But what we did instead was we looked at extremely violent events which kind of can be traced back to the party or can be traced back to how the party handled the aftermath of that violent event. So one was the Lakhimpur incident, one was the Hathras case, and in both we look at like it's more of an observational study, like what happens to BJP vote shares in the immediate vicinity of these places. Do they increase? Do they decrease? And I'm not saying that increase means that people were kind of mobilized because of that. What we can say is at least people did not sanction the party on these incidents. And then we also look at how the shifting of the blame game happened. There was the Kairana, like there was huge campaigns in Kairana, which was kind of an aftermath of the Muzaffarnagar riots, and how both the parties were able to construct this narrative in which at least the core and swing supporters are now blaming the other party for the riots, and especially in the case of Muzaffarnagar, there has been both academic as well as journalistic pieces in which one party or the other has been clearly identified in terms of the escalation that might have happened prior to the riot, and how the parties were able to kind of make use of the fact that public memory is short, and so how they can create those narratives about these past incidents.
Okay, thank you. That was actually a very comprehensive answer. I'm going to group a couple of questions together because I think they're getting at similar things. So there's one series of questions about any speculations, either based on data that you've collected or your studies, about variation, heterogeneous effects, shall we say, by caste, class, religion, gender, education. Do you have any hypotheses about how might linguistic, basically spatial variation across India change the results? Another question, I think this is something that is important for many people doing this kind of research now, many people who've also joined this seminar, just how you sort of went through the process of picking misinformation, right? And I asked you sort of some of this, right? Saying, I knew that you couldn't go in certain places, but how do you figure out what kind of stimuli that you want to present to the voter? What are the kinds of considerations you have, both from a practical researcher standpoint, but also from a theoretical standpoint?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second one and pass the first question to Neeraj. I think it's a really nice question. How did we pick this particular stimulus or the stimuli in the misinformation paper, and also the question on whether we pre-tested them. We did actually the word eludes me right now. What do you call it when you do a small subsample first? It's pilot. Pilot, yes. We did do a pilot for this survey, and we actually thought the pilot was absolutely crucial because we had to actually postpone our survey because of the second COVID wave. And we were really concerned about people actually being willing to interact with enumerators, and also whether, given that the elections had happened a little while ago, whether we would get good results on vote response and not huge over representation on support for the TMC, given that the TMC had won. We'd expect those winner kind of effects. So from that perspective, we weren't really in a position to pretest multiple stimuli, but I'd say we chose the stimulus based on like extensive literature research and also on the fact that this incident had actually happened, right? So this incident with the idol of goddess Kali falling, and initially there being allegations that it had been an act of vandalism or intentional, and that leading to quite some upheaval. That's exactly how it played out in the real world, but it was in a state far away from West Bengal. I think it was Tamil Nadu, if I remember correctly. And so from that perspective, we had some insight that, yeah, this, if there is the kind of incident that would be relevant for this, then it would be something like this. And also Kali being, prominent in West Bengal. So, and it seems to have worked because our prime worked the way we anticipated. But I think it's a fascinating question. It would be great to do this in the future, right? To test some primes, and also, as the question suggests, to look perhaps if there are gender differences. I think it's like, that's a huge open question, right? There's basically no research on this. And so I think that's a great research project. And if, what was the name of the person asking the question? I think it would be a great project to take on. So good luck with that.
Neeraj?
Yeah, so the way I interpret the question, and am I interpreting it correctly? Like, you want to know what are the heterogeneous treatment effects, right? Like the misinformation, we did not break it so much by caste, like the thing that was happening in West Bengal. Like we do have the caste information of the respondents, but we mostly do it in terms of Hindu Muslim, and yeah, I'll check to see if there is like a caste difference over there. But in terms of the violence, the response to violence, yes, we do see the strongest effects on forward castes. We do actually find very strong effects on BJP voters who are non-Yadav and non-Jatav. So one way it could be, the mobilizational effect, but another way could be to interpret that as like BJP really knows their vote base, like among the non-Yadavs and the non-Yadav OBCs and the non-Jatav SCs, those who respond to BJP kind of those who vote for BJP kind of respond in ways like upper caste voters, perfectly like upper caste voters. So we see that effect. But since both of these studies are within a particular state, and states are on linguistic lines, both of them, we do not see any linguistic effect as such, or or at least we do not capture any linguistic effect. But one thing that we find very interesting, and it's there as a control variable, we look at identity, like the salience of identity, in the sense we ask each respondent, what is the identity that matters most to you, your caste, your religion, your party, your state, your profession, and those who expectedly so, those who identify most with their caste or religion are the most likely to support a violent response by the party, and most likely to sanction a party for doing peaceful overtures.
So that's great. I am mindful of the time. I wanted to give 5-6 extra minutes because we started 5-6 minutes, and it's only fair, which means that we have about 3 minutes left. So any final comments that you might want to make, Ursula or Neeraj? We have one question remaining on, how credible is any kind of issue clarification? That's Shikar's question here. I can see in Q&A. When you issue a clarification on this mission, how do you ensure they trust the source is credible? It's an open question for people who do this kind of research. You can feel free to answer anything that either is troubling you based on all of the discussions we've had, or anything else you want to say to the audience as we shut shop.
So just to answer that question, that specific, like the the correction treatment that we are giving, so there is a heterogeneity over there. One group just is told that no, there was no vandalism and it just fell down on its own. And the second group is told that the temple priest confirmed that there was no. So over there, we are trying to create that that difference, wherein one is like a generic correction and one is supposedly coming from the temple priest where the idol was found. So you almost have like a person of authority telling you that no, there is this fake news that has happened.
So any closing comments from either of you? I know that I want to be mindful of the time.
No, I mean, mainly to say thanks. I think this was excellent, and we really needed to get, you know, like a deep dive into our work with an India-facing audience. So yeah, I'm just really glad that we had a chance to do that, and that the questions were excellent, and also thanks to you, Siddharth, for the excellent comments.
Neeraj, anything?
No, thank you. Thanks a lot. Your comments give us a lot to think about, not only in terms of the academic direction that we can take for the paper, but also in terms of what are the real world implications, the policy implications, the social implications of the work that we are doing. So it helps us to sharpen our analysis on both fronts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and staying with us a few minutes late. I really enjoyed this talk. And much more to come, I can see from this team, and I look forward to seeing where this all goes. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Siddharth, for your comments.
Thank you.